right, good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to have you all on today's virtual training on volunteer management in these times. Again, this is Jenny Huang. I am the Outreach Associate for the Get It Back campaign. So for those who don't know, the Get It Back campaign is a national effort at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities to promote the Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Tax Credit, free tax filing, and other tax benefits. We work with many community organizations, advocacy groups, and other orgs to connect workers with tax credits and free tax filing. We provide outreach tools, trainings, and resources to help you in your work. You can visit our website, eitcoutreach.org, for more information and all of these resources. So today's webinar is a part of our virtual training series that features the expertise of campaign partners in the field. You can find past trainings on our website and on our YouTube page. We know that recruiting and retaining VITA volunteers can be a challenge each year. That's why we put together several VITA volunteer resources last year. We have recruitment and retention best practices, tips for messaging, and some graphics that you can use in your outreach. We also created a recruitment video that you can show to potential volunteers. Last year, we presented 2 trainings on VITA volunteer recruitment that you can view on the website. This year's training builds on the previous ones while addressing this year's specific concerns. We all know that the 2016 tax season was a difficult one for many VITA sites. Today's training will focus on how to retain volunteers and recruit new ones, even amidst these challenges. We'll also chat about how you can use a growth mindset framework to view past obstacles as new opportunities. So today we are extremely lucky to have Nicole Fiocco, an enthusiastic leader who recognizes potential in partnerships and growth through innovative ideas. Nikki is currently the director of Volunteer Maryland, where she supervises staff and AmeriCorps members in a state and national AmeriCorps program. Prior to serving as director, Nikki was the program manager for the program and actively supervised and monitored 30 AmeriCorps members who served as volunteer coordinators at sites all across Maryland. Nikki had the pleasure of serving in Governor Hogan's Office of Constituent Services as the assistant supervisor and served as an AmeriCorps member herself back in 2012. Nikki holds a BA in Geography and Environmental Studies from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. As an avid podcast listener, Nikki is a lifelong learner and thrives on new ideas and creating systems to generate measurable outcomes. Nikki has 2 speeds, 1,000,000 miles an hour, or asleep. Originally from San Diego, California, Nikki is happy to call Maryland home for the past 12 years. And we are very happy that she decided to stay on the East Coast here with us. So without further ado, I will turn it to Nikki.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction, Jenny. And thank you for reaching out to Volunteer Maryland so that we can talk at everybody today during this webinar. So good afternoon to everyone in webinar land. I am super excited to be with everyone today and hope things are a-okay where you are. I bet this is kind of the calm before the storm. You know, we're beginning October. You're probably getting in full swing with the volunteer orientations and trainings, or possibly you're already in the thick of it right now, which is probably a good thing. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to sign up for and listen to this webinar. The intentions of this webinar is to really scratch the surface on ideas and hopefully give you a sense of understanding on how to deal with change and challenges in a volunteer program. If it's cool though, I'd kind of like to have an idea before we get started where people are listening in from. Like Jenny mentioned, I'm here in Annapolis, Maryland. Could maybe people type in the chat box to where they're listening in from? Would that be okay?
Absolutely. If you type them into the chat box, I will see them, see your answers, and call them out. So please feel free.
Yeah, let's see where everyone's representing.
Okay, so we got Knoxville, Tennessee, Roanoke, Virginia, San Antonio, Texas, Missouri, Gulfport, Mississippi, Virginia, Dallas, Texas, Huntington, West Virginia, Chicago, Columbia, South Carolina, St. Paul, Minnesota, Tacoma, Washington, Detroit, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Camden, New Jersey. The list is so long and going so fast that
That's great.
I cannot read them all, but really from everywhere.
That's great. Well, cool. Well, I'm so excited that everybody's representing here. Thank you again for everybody tuning in. So I have a whole section here that says, who am I? But Jenny did a pretty great job of saying who I am. The one thing that I just think that's really cool is that in 2012, I did serve as an AmeriCorps member in this program that I'm now the director of. And in 2012, I was recruiting volunteers focusing on environmental education. And after I served for that service year, I took the experience and shifted into a role for as an outreach manager and volunteer coordinator for an entire county here in Maryland, in Anne Arundel County. And I used the experience from Volunteer Maryland to launch a pretty successful position within the county. So our program is very diverse, and many of our members who go through our program go on to do wonderful and great things, and sometimes they stay right in their backyard. So I'm just real quickly talk really quickly about what Volunteer Maryland is. Like Jenny mentioned, we are an AmeriCorps program. We're housed in the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives, and our building's actually located in Crownsville, Maryland. Just a quick history of our program is that we were actually created by Governor Schaefer back in 1992, before AmeriCorps was actually funded by the federal government. We have over 25 years of experience in volunteer coordination and management and training, and our founders for the program have created curriculums and cycles that have been used year after year successfully throughout the program. So this is our mission. I won't read it because I'm sure that all of you are quite capable of doing so. But Volunteer Maryland's work is our site's work. We partner with organizations that are making huge impacts in communities, just like all of your organizations are. We've actually partnered with Maryland Cash Campaign, Baltimore Cash, and which are focusing on financial education, as well as other VITA sites throughout the state. This year, we have a location in Calvert County, Maryland, that uses a similar concept as VITA, and they do use some VITA volunteers. They teach individuals and families how to complete their own tax forms. So how do we do this? We use what's called a multiplier model, and again, this was built by our founders, and we start with 4 state employees, 3 full-time and 1 3/4 time. We have a program manager that focuses on all the current services or during the current service year and supervises a distributed service corps of about 30 members. We have an outreach manager that is perpetually living in the future until the launch of our service year, where they match members with potential partner sites. We have an operations coordinator that works on the back end of the program, financial reconciliation, state and federal funding, management, and catering. A topic that we find very, very important here in Volunteer Maryland. The catering is always a big topic here. And then we have the director, which is me, who just tries to keep all the plates spinning. So 4 staff every year, and we aim to recruit 32 AmeriCorps members. 30 of those members will be volunteer coordinators, and 2 of those members will serve in our office as peer leaders. We place or match 30 of our AmeriCorps members with 30 service sites throughout Maryland. These sites can be nonprofits, government agencies, or schools. These organizations are focused on addressing issues in the area of education, environmental issues, human needs, veteran services, as well as natural disasters in some cases. So last year, running from September 2016 to August 1st, 2017, the AmeriCorps members serving as volunteer coordinators recruited over 8,000 community volunteers who served 22,000 Maryland citizens. So rather than having our members do the service, they recruit volunteers. which increases the amount of community engagement and the amount of constituents the organizations can serve. It also leaves in place a sustainable program after the member leaves after 11 months. So you can kind of say that VITA is similar in a way. VITA has its own multiplier model. As I was beginning to get this webinar generated, this really stuck in my mind. Your organization probably has a pretty small staff. You know, if the audience, if you guys were all standing in front of me, you'd probably start clapping right now. So the majority of your organizations probably have a small staff, and you recruit a bunch of volunteers so they can serve many households who will benefit from tax refunds or connect them with vital social services for wherever your organization is located. But for today, we're going to focus on these folks, the volunteers. Because quite frankly, without them, then there's no this. And with no volunteers or clients to serve, then there's no benefits from this. So today, I'm hoping to offer information for you and your organizations around ideas of, like Jenny said, recovering after a challenging year of change. For this, we're going to actually look at 2 models on how to deal with change. And then I'm going to talk about a concept that I've actually become pretty fascinated with and feel it's really important to think about in terms of volunteer management. And that's the idea of mindset based off of a book by Carol Dweck entitled, well, you guessed it, Mindset. Then we'll briefly touch on the importance of starting with your organizational why, especially when recruiting and retaining volunteers. Finally, we'll share some ideas. Well, I'll share some ideas on how your organization may think about making volunteering to be a tax preparer can be sexy, because we want to make sure that people think their volunteer opportunity is something that they want to talk about. It seems like a huge undertaking in an hour, but I can talk pretty fast and flip through these slides. So let's get rolling. So first, we need to understand the VITA site's struggles. This is what your sites may have been going through with the challenge in the new with the new software of Taxlayer. I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to speak that word, but I do say it a couple times in this webinar. You can tell me later if it's something I shouldn't say, but yeah, Taxlayer. When Jenny mentioned that the VITA sites have gone through a big training requirement change along with systems reporting changes coming from the IRS, her question for Volunteer Maryland to offer suggestions on how to retain volunteers after a tough organizational year, I asked more questions and I began to identify the true need for this training, and that's the perspective of this required change from the organization and how the need for this training and the perspective of that it requires of this change, and how the energy and struggle of the change might affect the volunteers' desire to hang around and serve at your site. So like she mentioned, retention and recruiting new volunteers. So you already have gone through the change. It has already happened. You may still even be dealing with the fallout of the changes, but moving forward, how will your organization deal with the change and involve the volunteers in this change? As I mentioned earlier, Volunteer Maryland places AmeriCorps members in organizations throughout Maryland. They focus on building and improving the volunteer program in the organization. Over the year of service, one of the many responsibilities of a Volunteer Maryland AmeriCorps member is implementing and dealing with change. Actually, the role of an AmeriCorps member is a signal for change. The sites request Volunteer Maryland's intervention to work through Volunteer Maryland program conundrums. So this is right up our alley. So diving into the first model, we're going to work with Chip and Dan Heath, 2 brothers who have written several books. The information I'm going to share with you from their book, Switch, and this is research that was previously created by our previous director in this position. From my communication with Jenny, I understand that the volunteers had to learn a new software, which means your site had to create new orientations and trainings, probably without a whole bunch of support. She also shared with me that in general, because of the formatting, tax returns took longer, and there was an increase in self-employment income due to, like I have on the slide there, people's involvement with Uber and Lyft, which I guess required an advanced training. This is a whole lot of change involving a whole lot of people. Looking at why change is hard, Chip and Dan start with this. People resist change, but it's not that easy. Let's look at this. So we see here babies, lots of babies. So babies come into parents' lives every day. I guess every minute, possibly every second. I'm not quite sure what the statistics is, but they welcome that change. Think about the sheer magnitude of this change. Would anyone agree to work for a boss who will wake up at least twice in the middle of the night screaming for trivial administrative duties? What about if every time you wore a new piece of clothing, your boss would spit up on it? Okay, that's just weird. That's a weird example. But people do this. They don't resist this change. They welcome it, and they volunteer for it for the most part. Change is not always bad. VITA software change, difficult, but not bad, but necessary. So new babies, difficult, not bad. And we can say there's a massive amount of motivation when it comes to accepting and dealing with the baby change. So Chip and Dan present the argument that all successful changes share a common pattern. And they base their idea on another idea from Jonathan Haidt from his book, The Happiness Hypothesis. Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist at the NYU. And he says, in every decision we make, we have a rider, an elephant, and a path. The rider is our reason, our rational side. It holds the reins and seems to be the leader. But here's the thing. The rider is small in comparison to the elephant. And anytime the rider and the elephant disagree, the elephant is going to win. Overslept, overeaten, texted your ex in the middle of the night, procrastinated, skipped the gym. The weakness of the elephant is clear. It can be lazy and skittish, often looking for quick payoff. The elephant will also follow the herd if they don't have the clear motivation. And as Dan and Chip say, the elephant looks to the herd for clues on how to act. And the elephant's not going to check in with the rider before it starts following the herd. So when change efforts fail, it's often the elephant's fault. The elephant's faults are actually the rider's strength, the ability to think long term, to plan, to think beyond, I want ice cream. What may surprise you is the elephant has enormous strengths also, and the rider has crippling weaknesses. Emotion is what the elephant's turf is. Love and compassion are its thing. The spine stiffening when you need to stand up for yourself, yep, that's the elephant. So what's the rider's biggest weakness? The rider tends to overanalyze and overthink. He spins his wheels. Have you ever heard of analysis paralysis? I think I get that every day. I wish I was more like Steve Jobs and I would be okay with a white shirt and black pants, but I kind of try to be stylish. It's just tiring by the time 7 o'clock rolls around to figure out what I'm going to wear. But anyway, here's the other thing that is interesting about the rider. Holding on to those reins all the time causes fatigue. Thinking about your VITA sites. How many significant changes have occurred for your staff and volunteers? Their ability to deal with change is in direct relationship to how often they had to manage their elephant. They have change fatigue. They've drained their self-control. It's what makes us feel like if there's one more change, so help me. Those reins are getting very, very heavy. So what we want to do is direct the rider and motivate the elephant. There needs to be something so compelling that the elephant will want to move in that direction. And the rider needs to have a crystal clear idea, logic of what the end game is. and this will help shape the path. So Chip and Dan conclude we need to direct the writer. They used a real-life example to provide context to their point, and this might help you wrap your mind around this idea as well. This is a needed change. So their example is that there's a needed change because there's high malnutrition in Vietnam. In 1990, Jerry Sternin, who was working with Save the Children, was asked to open an office in Vietnam. The government of Vietnam had invited Save the Children into the country to help with malnutrition and children. So his arrival was kind of a bit chilly, if you can imagine, and he was told by the foreign minister that not everyone was delighted by his presence, and he only had 6 months to make a difference. That's a lot of pressure. Here's what the data told him. Malnutrition was from an intertwined set of factors. Sanitation was poor, poverty was nearly universal, clean water was not readily available. All three of these factors were not going to change in the next 6 months. That's for sure. So where to start? He traveled to rural villages and met with groups of local mothers. The mothers divided into teams and went out to weigh and measure every child in their village. Then they shared their results. And he asked if any very, very poor children were healthy. The answer was yes, but how? Let's look at what they were doing. The mothers with the healthy children were feeding them sweet potato leaves. There was an abundance of this resource, but it was viewed as a low-cost food choice. They also ate shrimp and crabs from the rice fields. They actually ate small meals 4 times a day, and the mothers were hand-feeding the children as opposed to letting them feed themselves. The children were healthy and thriving in villages where many were dwindling. And the mothers also encouraged eating when the children were sick. So Sternin found the bright spots. Sternin did not make some major announcement on this discoveries. He said this. He said, knowledge does not change behavior. We all know an overweight doctor or a divorced marriage counselor. Telling would not change this. Practice would. So 50 malnourished families met in a group of 10 to cook together. The moms were required to use sweet potato leaves and shrimp and wash their hands. Remember, we talked about sanitation? They cooked their meals together and acted their way into change. Most important, it was their change from local wisdom in the village. His role was only to help them see that they could do it. So, Sternin motivated the elephant, and he directed the rider and shaped the path by discovering the bright spots. So when you're thinking about the volunteers, how could you tap into their motivation, the motivational elephant, direct their logic, the logical side, and shape the path for successful change? Can you point out some bright spots from their software change, or why volunteers at your VITA site will benefit from these changes? Again, when Jenny and I were corresponding, she mentioned many of the new volunteers did not mind the new tax preparation formatting. Perhaps you can find some volunteers who could be like the village women and teach others, teach them into the change and focus on the bright spots of the software change. In order for the elephant to stay focused and on the path, there has to be emotion, the thing that connects us to the change. This emotional charge helps maintain self-control. Speaking of self-control, can you just smell these cookies through this virtual interwebs that we're on? I'm going to talk about another study where students were asked to take part in a study, and it actually started with cookies. The students arrived in a room that was full of the smell of fresh baked chocolate chip cookies, and I know we can all smell that right now because I sure can. On the table were 2 bowls. one with these delicious smelling cookies and the other with radishes. I can't even say those the same way. Delicious smelling cookies and radishes. There we go. Maybe now radishes sound more enticing. The students were split into two groups. One could eat some of the cookies, but none of the radishes. The others could only eat radishes and none of the cookies. That's just pure evil. The research then left the room, hoping to entice the radish eaters to eat some of the cookies, but they didn't. So looks like the study's over. But they had one more task. They asked the students to trace a geographic design with a pencil. And the pencil could not leave the line, meaning one continuous line. They couldn't do it. It actually was impossible for them to complete the task, but that was not the findings. The interesting piece was how long would they try? The cookie eaters would work on the task for an average of 19 minutes before giving up. The radish eaters only 8. Why? Lack of motivation. Get serious. Who's really going to sit there and munch on spicy radishes while working on an impossible task? How are you motivating the volunteers through this software change or through any change? Don't forget to motivate the elephant. This can be reminding volunteers of the community need that they're tackling every time they come in and volunteer, or the impact that they're making. How many clients they're serving, how many tax returns, how many clients are being connected to vital resources within the community. Also being extremely clear with the writer about the intended outcomes. So just keep in mind, what seems like laziness may be lack of motivation, and what seems like resistance to change can be burnout from so much change, like we were talking, like I had mentioned earlier, holding those reins and having all of the change happen at one time. And because this seems to be an impossible task, then the change might not feel worth it. Also think about what your internal organizational dialogue is about discussing the change. So if the staff are frustrated, is that carrying over to the volunteers? How are you keeping the tensions away from the volunteers? So don't forget, look at the size of the rider compared to the elephant. Reason, data, and facts will not motivate that 3-ton emotional elephant. There needs to be a pull or compelling reason, a motivation like chocolate chip cookies for the volunteers to follow the path of change and have successful change. And also continue to volunteer at your site and to come back year after year. So I just want to take a moment to address a question that was sent to me yesterday from Jenny that came in from the registrants before this webinar. So the question was, how do you prevent drop-off during the volunteers off season? And this is a really great question. If volunteer retention is in the forefront of your organization's focus, then the suggestion could be look at the elephant. What's motivating the elephant to stick through the change in the software and commit to the intense training and stick it out for several tax seasons? So again, talking about keeping those volunteers engaged during the off season. So one of our sites that I think I'm going to be talking about in a minute here. They're a partner that we have here in Howard County, and year after year, at the end of the service year, they dealt with environmental education programs. So the end of the service year or the end of the volunteer season was generally the end of school. They would give a end of the year picnic. They were finding that volunteers were not attending these picnics. So they surveyed the volunteer to understand what was their motivation. And they found that they were lifelong learners, and an evening of listening to a speaker or talking about a relevant topic was much more enjoyable than spending an evening of being wined and dined or being out on a picnic. So my suggestion, and what we found has worked for our volunteer coordinators, is by engaging these volunteers in lunch and learns, or bringing in speakers on topics that your volunteers are interested in. And it might not be directly related to tax preparation, but a simple poll of your volunteers to find out what they're interested in and what drives them will help you think about how you can engage those volunteers during the off season. It's also a great time to do focus groups about how you can do things differently within your organization. Having the volunteers involved in these changes or involved in these improvements gets buy-in into your program, and it also is seen as a way of retaining volunteers, because a volunteer may see another volunteer participating at a higher level, and they may aim to do that, so they may want to stick around longer. Those are some suggestions for the off-season retention. Really getting focused on what your volunteers are interested in, and quite frankly, this comes from the staff, the very small staff that you have. The volunteer manager or the coordinator has to be a super big priority to your organization. So keep in mind that the writer will flee if there's ambiguity. So if they don't know specifically what they're working towards, they're going to find a different path. So use specific data and results that you want to see and even past accomplishments, which I'm sure all of you already do. And the elephant will wander if the path or motivation's not clear, so remove any obstacles. So an obstacle may be the volunteers don't understand the need for change. In this case, in your software change, seems like they have no choice, right? Things have never been done like this before is oftentimes a volunteer pushback, could be a staff pushback, it will never work, and it's just too much. In order to keep the elephant going, obstacles along the path really need to be removed. Perhaps a volunteer who has been successful at learning the new software can lead a training or a Q&A for the new volunteers or for the previous volunteers, because if they see that somebody's being successful, might want to do it as well. Finding out what volunteers feel are the major obstacles for returning to volunteering or continuing at your site. Ask for their input on this, because if not, then you're projecting what you believe the obstacles to be, and that may not be true for the volunteers. It's super important to have communications with your volunteers. All right, so in order to get volunteers to accept change, we need to go from volunteer onboarding to volunteer serving the households so the households can benefit from their refunds. Let's quickly look at a second model, which is a little more structured and may feel more concrete. This idea is from Ascent, an organizational change counseling firm, and Juan Riboldi is the source of this information. So what they say is there are 5 barriers in implementing successful change. Low trust, what is that? Division between departments, could be between staff and volunteers. Hidden agendas or politicking between board or staff. Distrust of management. Too many unexplained changes. Hopefully your organization is very transparent with the volunteers about the changes that are happening. Lack of focus is also one of the topics. Too many incentives, which something like new programs all the time, and scope creep, running after the funding. Poor capability, getting the right person for the role. So this case could be good, reliable volunteers. Unclear roles and responsibilities. Who's responsible for the volunteers? My experience with VITA sites is that there's a site coordinator. Is that site coordinator a clear passage, a clear communication and connection with that volunteer? Also, poor defined work processes. Who does what? Who processes things? Who do they go to for answers? Weak commitment. Inconsistency in leadership examples. No leadership with the volunteers. They show up at a site, there's no program manager, they have nobody to check in with. I'll be real honest with you folks. If volunteers have a bad experience, they're more likely not to come back. So volunteer management should be at the top of your game every time, because it can just be one experience that turns somebody off. Playing favorites or ignoring bad contact. Why do these volunteers get to show up late? Rewarding misaligned with performances. Why do difficult volunteers stick around? And finally, delayed results. So uncleared goals, back to the writer, lack of accountability, no feedback on results. Elephant. So the sponsor profile identifies areas of support and resistance. The more allies, the more commitment and influence you'll have with change. Good to know, you need at least one ally to make systemic change. Building a network of allies should be a major focus and is an effective change agent. Followers and friendly supporters are willing to lend their vote. As a group, they can help change public opinion. Followers help convert fence setters, which are more likely converted. Challengers by themselves account for passive opposition. But if organized as a group, can voice significant resistance to change. Best advice to engage challengers: invite them to participate, listening to their concerns and clarifying misconceptions. Blockers are decidedly opposed to change and will likely use their influence to block its progress. The best strategy for dealing with the blocker is to actively include them as part of the coalition, giving them a stake in the outcomes. Kind of what we talked about. What are your motivations? Getting people involved. Building on areas of agreements and negotiating for degrees of support. Really, really getting those blockers involved. This recap can help address another question that was submitted yesterday, and that was, what message should we send to communicate with the right volunteers who are capable and willing? Who should we target? If you can identify the challenges and remove any obstacles, focus on the bright spots like Jerry Sterner did. Sweet potato leaves, shrimp, crabs, eat every 4 hours. I'm not sure if that'll help retain your volunteers. Probably eating every 4 hours would. What are the bright spots in your program? So who are the allies in your volunteer program? Who can you recruit to move the fence sitters to the followers group? And how are you going to engage the blockers? So when you ask the question, who should we target? You want to be targeting those people who have that direct tie to your mission, the writers. We also want the big elephants, no pun intended, the ones that have that direct motivation. We want to get those allies going. So those are the people you want to focus on. Who has that mindset? Speaking of mindset, so all of this change is great and all, but is there a way to embrace change in a way that's not so painful? So let's look at mindset. Thinking about the mindset of the organization and perhaps how it influences the volunteer culture, Dr. Carol Dweck, a Stanford University psychologist, discovered a groundbreaking idea, the power of mindset. This is right off the back of the book. I'm just saying, I'm not trying to reinvent Random House, so I'm just reading what it says. In the book, she shows how success in school, work, sports, and arts is almost every area of the human endeavor can be directly influenced by how we think about our talents and abilities. So I want you to think about the talents and abilities of yourself and the staff and the volunteers. And I'll be honest with you, this is new territory here. But as I was reading this material, I can really see how this work can translate to retention of volunteers and improvement of managing volunteers. So before we get started, I wanted you to kind of think about where your mindset is. So we're going to have a couple polls here that I've been talking at you now for about, 42 minutes. I'm going to roll through this material pretty quickly. So I'd like your engagement in here. If you could go to the poll here, Jenny.
All right. I'm going to launch the poll now.
Okay.
All right. Can everyone see that on their screen? Can you see that, Nikki?
So, I sure can. So answer this question or pick one of these options. Do you believe you're a certain kind of person and there's not much that you can do to really change that? Just quickly put your answer. Don't think too much about it. We can't see who answered it, so we're not going to judge you. And then whenever you're ready, Jenny, we can just go ahead and look at those results.
All right. So I've closed it, and now you should be able to see the results now.
Great. So 27% of you somewhat agree with that. Okay. And 44 somewhat disagree. So, okay, almost half, and then strongly disagree. So there's more of us or more of you that disagree with that statement to some extent. Okay, cool. Let's go to the next poll. Okay, so what do you think about this statement? No matter what kind of person you are, you can always change substantially. So we're thinking about talents here. We're thinking about intelligence and skills. Do you agree with this statement? Strongly, somewhat, disagree? Whenever you're ready, Jenny. They're pretty quick on the trigger here. Great. So here we are. We've got majority here feel like they strongly agree. Okay, cool. Let's do the next one. Okay, so you can do things differently, but the important parts of who you are can't really change. You agreeing with that? You disagreeing? Somewhat agreeing? And whenever you're ready, we'll just look at those results. All right, so we got somewhat agree, 51%. Okay, so more people are agreeing with this than disagreeing. All right, and then we have one more poll real quick to just kind of understand where everyone's at. And this one's, you can always change basic things about the kind of person you are. You agreeing with that? Somewhat? All right, so we've got majority of the people, majority of everyone out there agree with this. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you for participating in my poll. So what does this all mean? Well, as you can imagine, we're looking at two different mindsets here. So we've got the fixed mindset, and I'm just going to walk through what that means, or the definition of that. Oh, if we can go to the next slide.
Nikki, if you're able to click on the slide, you should be able to move forward with it.
Okay, so let's look at this real quick. Questions 1 and 3, these were fixed mindsets. So we had about half of the people disagreeing with the first question. So most people were falling into the growth mindset. And then for the second and fourth question, we've got, again, majority of people falling into this growth mindset. So I kind of feel like for this kind of organization and for the service that you do, growth mindset is really where the strengths lie. So let's just look at this. According to Dweck, a fixed mindset believes your qualities are carved in stone. This can create urgency to prove yourself over and over again instead of trying to learn from and repair their failures. People with a fixed mindset may simply try to repair their self-esteem. An example of this is they may look for people who are worse off than themselves. In this mindset, actually failure is finite, just can't do it. In a growth mindset, this is based on the belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through your self-efforts. Everyone can change and grow through application experience. So again, I remind you to think about this in relativity okay, I can't say this word. Again, this is new territory for Volunteer Maryland, but it is important to look at these different mindsets. Cultivating a growth mindset mentality could be a step in the right direction to attracting those skilled volunteers to your organization. There was a question on yesterday that was presented to me on how do you present our need for volunteers so that they will want to be part of the action and be excited about volunteering. If the culture of your organization has such a draw, volunteers will want to be part of it. So it's more than just the volunteer opportunity and finding those magic words. A fixed mindset organization might feel somewhat like either you have have it or you don't. You might get the software or you don't. Dwight calls this a culture of genius. A growth mindset culture feels like people can grow and improve with efforts, good strategies, coaching, and mentoring. She calls this a culture of development. So providing that culture can attract the volunteers that you're looking for in your program. So when we look at the two softwares and we think of the mindset, Taxwise is familiar, perhaps easier to use for ongoing volunteers. The autofill, where they can, that's just, autofill in and of itself is just wonderful. Taxlayer is new, is glitchy in the software, formatting's not that familiar. So if we look at the two mindsets to tackle this change, so if we look at Taxwise, it's pretty much gone, and now volunteers and volunteer managers or site coordinators are working with Taxlayer. So growth mindset, or the culture of development, learning and expanding, failures or struggles are ways to grow and improve and make more of an impact on the clients. So really tackling this move to Taxlayer and understanding how to train the volunteers and how to keep them engaged, tackling it with this growth mindset, encouraging them that, yep, it's a struggle, yep, this is difficult, but guess what? We're going to grow and we're going to improve and we're going to do this together and we're going to fully support you. Fixed mindset, well, I don't even really need to go there because pretty much the ship has sailed. So how do these things tie together? Well, I bet your volunteer allies and followers have more of a growth mindset and would be willing to grab those fence sitters and communicate with the blockers. Start jotting down, as I'm talking at you, some names of volunteers that you can rely on to be leaders. Volunteers you know have the mindset that will nurture a culture of growth. This can also tap into the retention of volunteers, give them some buy-in, some leadership, and they will stick around. This also takes communication and commitment from the volunteer program and needs to be at the forefront of the organization's values. So as this is just coming from one person, it's going to be real difficult to make a cultural change. So thinking back to Jonathan Haidt's model of the elephant and the rider, how can you use growth mindset to motivate the volunteers to continue to stick out the software change, the intense training, then come back year after year? There'll need to be some rationality there for the rider, but a whole lot of motivation to keep that elephant on the right path. Leaning towards a growth mindset will open up opportunities for volunteers to feel like learning new things is in their best interest and will help them gain a whole new skill set, which learning a whole new skill set can be a whole new skill set. So last concept here. This book actually started me down a rabbit hole. This that I actually haven't been able to pull myself back out of. And it started with a TED Talk, if you're familiar with technology, entertainment, and design talks. It was by Simon Sinek a few years ago. This led me to buy and read and devour his book, Start With Why. And the book has amazing ideas on how to create movements in business leadership, intervention, and social impact by drilling down on a clear understanding of why you do what you do. Sounds simple, but I bet even though I'm speaking to VITA sites, your why will sound different, which is totally okay. Simon Sinek says this about the why. Very few people or companies can clearly articulate why they do what they do. When I say why, I meaning Simon, he doesn't mean to make money. it's the result. By why, he means what your purpose, cause, or belief is. Why does your organization exist? Why do you get out of bed every morning? And why should anyone care or volunteer? And I added that last little piece. So the why gets lost in the how and the what. VITA, tax returns. Clients get refunds. These are the whats and the hows. When you want to hook volunteers, you really want to drill down on the whys. Or we could say, in volunteer and service, drilling down and getting clear about your community need and how the volunteers are going to address and help move that needle. So for purposes of bringing everything together and wrapping things up, I think this slide demonstrates pretty well how we can take the models I talked about and put them together to start developing a compelling volunteer recruitment and retention strategy. Let's think of it in this way. The what of your organization is the rational writer, volunteers preparing taxes for households so they will receive their refunds or be current on their taxes or connected to vital resources within the community. The what is the result of the how. It's the action. How do we do this, or what is the path? We recruit volunteers who are trained and certified in tax preparation. They meet and work with clients to prepare and file taxes. This is the how your organization gets to the goal. The how is the action. But why? Why do you do this? Certainly you're not jumping out of bed to dance with Taxlayer or deal with yet another case of where you can't figure out who has custody of the child or who's the head of the household. There's something more to this why. Speak to the elephant. Motivate the elephant and to stay on the path. I don't know your individual whys, but I can imagine there's a desire for social justice and equality for every class, race, gender, and social status. For your why is the belief of your organization, the belief of making things better or improving someone's current situation. Knowing your why, staying crystal clear about your why, and revisiting your organization's why can help address this question. There was something submitted yesterday. How could we target those volunteers, recruit volunteers who buy in? You're going to want to recruit volunteers who, first of all, buy into your why. Simon Sinek uses the example of Apple. Apple does not try to convert Google phone users. They focus on people who are using the Apple product. So the sites that I mentioned earlier who were using the lunch and learns for the environmental education volunteers, they realized that that was their key volunteer. Those are the people they went after to volunteer more often. So they went into those communities. You know who your strongest volunteers are. They already are buying into your why. Continue to connect with that community. I wanted to just real quickly go over 2 case studies that also have challenges with recruitments. The first one is CASA, and these volunteers are matched with children who are going through the court system for one reason or another. The volunteer is an advocate and a mentor and a familiar, friendly face for the child. Their volunteer obligations last months and sometimes years. In my experience with CASA volunteer programs, the barriers and obstacles for recruitment were the length of time the volunteers had to commit, the fact that sometimes volunteers never even saw their case settled. Some of the children turned 18 and were no longer qualified for the CASA volunteer and or moved out of the court systems. So that was a big obstacle. So how did the CASA that we worked with deal with those obstacles? They offered extreme support for their volunteers. They brought them together for Q&As. They brought them together for times to meet each other, because oftentimes the volunteers weren't interacting with each other. So they created a culture within that volunteer program to have them feel very, very connected to CASA, very, very connected to CASA's why. And then one more quick example is the Conflict Resolution Center. We deal with we have partnered with several conflict resolution centers here in Maryland, and one of the barriers with recruitment of volunteers for this program, again, is intensive training. They require 40 hours of training as well as 40 hours of volunteering during their first year after they first get their certification. And the volunteers are gung-ho, they're ready to be mediators, and sometimes they get into positions where the people that they're supposed to be mediating don't even show up. And that can happen time and time again. What have the coordinators done in the past? The volunteer coordinator that served for us last year called every single one of those volunteers. I think it was like about 120 volunteers. He called them personally to thank them for serving as a volunteer at their center. Those volunteers became extremely motivated to fulfill the need of the organization and extremely connected to the coordinator. So reaching out to your volunteers personally really goes a long way, especially in the day and age of emails and e-cards and all that good stuff. So I just thought this was kind of accurate for who I'm addressing today. And so, right, who add a couple extra zeros to your refund line, who's really going to worry about that? So my last kind of stretch here about how to make your tax preparations, that volunteer opportunity sexy. Well, mastering the message, let me tell you, if Volunteer Maryland had a magic messaging that would compel every individual to stop, drop what they're doing and volunteer, we could turn Volunteer Maryland into for-profit, and I'd actually be talking to you from the White Sands Beach and not here in Crownsville, Maryland. The magic is staying with your why, to be honest with you, to focus on your community need and speak to the motivation of that volunteer. Also making that message very clear that there's a solution to the critical community need and the volunteer will be part of that solution. Really having them understand that they are going to move the needle on this problem. So these are some play on words for Taxlayer. Maybe they're ninja tax slayers. I thought about Freddy Krueger in a not scary way, but I don't think that's possible, so I think it's a bad example. But what about Wolverine with those crazy metal claws? Play with what you have. Another way is to finding the magic message is to have the volunteers do it. Record video, take testimonials of why they volunteer and why they keep coming back. Use those to recruit new volunteers. Use numbers to show the impact on the community. Share these numbers with your volunteers on a regular basis, not just after the tax season. This has been volunteers that we've worked with have really appreciated with the volunteer coordinator let them know how their service was going on a weekly or monthly basis. So I can't believe that I covered that all that quickly, and I know I kind of rushed through this all. And again, I just wanted to brush the surface on some of these ideas here about dealing with change, looking at the mindset in your organization, just really honing in on your why of your organization and putting that at the forefront, because that's going to be your strongest recruiting messages. So here at Volunteer Maryland, we have a really small support team, like I mentioned, and we use all of these strategies to have a successful service year. So I'm not sure if we're going to do a Q&A after this, but I can stick around. But that's my contact information. Feel free to call me or email me. I would love to chat more about some of these topics or answer any questions that I didn't answer during this webinar. And it's 4:01. I did it.
You did. Oh my goodness. Congratulations. So we did receive a couple really quick questions. So in the beginning, you did mention that you work with an organization that teaches folks to do their own taxes. Was that Maryland Cash?
That is Calvert Cash in Calvert County.
Got it. Okay, great.
But I think there might be parts of Maryland Cash that coach individuals, but I'm not sure.
This might be a little too specific, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about this. So Terry Reed was wondering, so one thing that's going to be tricky this year is they're doing two-step. It's that two-step process. Basically, when you log into Taxlayer, you also will have to receive a text on your phone that will give you a code that you have to log in with. And so Terry is worried that this will be hard on some older volunteers. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, it's, you know, it's interesting how these systems that we have to use are now invading our our own personal phones. Here at our office, you have to log into the Wi-Fi. You have to put your phone number in, and you get a code. My suggestion would just be there to support the volunteer. And if the organization could have a phone readily available for them, you know, I don't know if that's always available. Technology is expensive. So, you know, we have members that are serving with us that are in their senior 50s, I think maybe even 60s. And technology sometimes can be a little bit scary, or not even scary, but just intimidating to some degree. And just pairing them with somebody that gives them the confidence, like, look, number one, you can't break this. And number two, I'm going to help you through every step. And my experience with VITA, I know not I know because I haven't been there, but I've heard that it's very busy, and it can get a little overwhelming. There's a lot of people who are trying to serve as quickly as possible. So really using that growth mindset sort of idea to put everybody at ease, like, we're learning and it's okay. That's really my own suggestion. I don't have like a solid, this'll work. I wish I did.
Mm-hmm. No, that's okay. That's perfect. So those were the only questions we received during the actual presentation. So thank you so much for giving this presentation training for us today. And again, for everyone else, please stay in contact with all of us and shoot Nikki any questions that you might still have. We're very curious to learn about how your volunteer recruitment goes this year, and we'd love to hear from you all. So thank you again, Nikki. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. As another reminder, we will send out the recording, slides, and links to all the volunteer resources that we mentioned earlier via email within 1 week.